Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 4 of Demand Decoded. This live event series decodes the secret of successful B2B marketing. Thanks for being here today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us live. And we're Blend, if you haven't heard of us already, a B2B website and demand generation agency. Today, we got Phil here as usual, and also Rob, who is a senior content writer at Blend. And we'll be discussing blogging, which is such an interesting topic these days because in the past, blogging was the go-to strategy for B2B marketing. But as other tactics have emerged and moved on, it seems to have kind of fizzled out a little bit. So in this event, we're going to look at blogging, discuss it, and see how the power of blogging fits into a 2023 demand generation strategy. And as usual, as we go along, feel free to ask questions, drop them in the comments on LinkedIn, and we'll just pick them up as we go along. We always get some good questions that provide some great conversations and insight, and hopefully, help answer your individual questions. So yeah, don't be shy, pop them in, and we'll answer them as we go. So I think, a good place to start would be to actually, understand the business case for blogging, especially in 2023. So Phil, do you want to talk us through why, or even if businesses should be blogging in 2023?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi everybody. It's a really great question actually, and it's subject to quite a few different forces, not least the fact that marketers do tend to go to the new shiny thing, as methods, as tactics become more broadly understood and adopted. So I think the question, is blogging still relevant in 2023 is a good place to start. And while the landscape is changing and always will change, particularly when new technologies of the moment are considered, search and Google and search engines are still such a huge area of opportunity for a lot of businesses. Not all businesses, but a lot of businesses can still gain an incredible amount of business if they are leveraging organic search to capture some of the demand for the topic that they're relevant to, the solutions they offer, and what they sell. And blogging still is a pretty good way to align to your business to the requirements of the search engine algorithms to be found by buyers when they use that channel as part of their research processes. So there's still a place and a role for blogging in the marketing strategy in 2023 because there is still a ton of opportunity coming to companies via that channel. Although there are, of course, changes in the role of that channel in the buying process and therefore in the marketing strategy, but it's still very much there. And I've always liked blogging as a tactic, or even broader as a strategy, I suppose, for its relative predictability. In amongst a lot of marketing that can be hit or miss in terms of whether you generate a result, a return on your investment, a measurable gain, blogging's pretty good at creating a reliable, predictable outcome. It's a relatively good value for money approach to producing something that's sustainable, that you don't have to sort of hit the nail on the head with every single piece of it, but over time you can usually produce a visible, reliable, predictable result in the form of increased traffic, yes, but I think it's more important to think about discoverability within a topic, within a field. Spreading your search net far and wide through blog content and good optimization of it is a great way to increase the footprint that you have across the search that's happening in your field for your topic. So it's a really good way to do that. And it still offers those evergreen compounding returns in that a piece of content once published can send visitors to you for a very long period of time because not all of the topics shift dramatically quickly. So it's not unusual, as Rob will attest, for blog content to have a shelf life, of many years in driving good quality traffic to your site. So unlike a paid strategy where when the budget stops, the traffic stops, you can layer up this blog content and you can produce compounding returns. Not many marketing tactics offer you that in this day and age. So I like it for that reason.
Yeah, and I think from a content perspective, if you are starting to, you look at the market that's out there now, and you think, okay, well, we need to start producing some content because that's what everybody says that we need to be doing. Where do you start? And when we talk about, you were just talking about budget and the limitations that marketing teams have. Blogging makes for a good baseline to say, what are the kinds of things we want to be talking about? How can we go about talking about them? How are we going to go about gathering all that information together? And you can use blogging as a nice kind of value for money play that then can be morphed into other types of content. You can repurpose it as and when you develop, and you've basically sort of proved the value of the content you're producing. So you see the content that people like starts to really gain traction, and then you can look at it to say, okay, what else can we do with it? So I think a lot of the businesses at the moment are looking around at all the different multimedia options that are available, some that can be done on a budget quite effectively. I mean, this conversation now that we're having and broadcasting live to LinkedIn, even 5 years ago, it was a huge upfront investment to actually deliver. People are saying, we should be producing high value, as in like expensive high fidelity content, on a shoestring budget, and a lot of times that's not possible. And I think with blogging, it's useful to so use that as your baseline, and then you can look to repurpose it into other channels as and when you've got stuff to actually work with. If you're starting from nothing, this is a great place to start.
It's a great way. Yeah, I agree with that, Rob. It's a great way to facilitate the ideation that's necessary for the full spectrum of channels that you're going to use. And it's also a great way to harness some additional benefit from content created specifically for those other channels. So I think in most cases, it's a really good muscle to flex and not let wither, because it can power you, even if it isn't the absolute highest priority channel for your business. You can gain from it, even as you're doing other things and even as you're exploring other methods. And to your point about multimedia, there is a lot of appeal in higher cost formats, but I think they are all higher cost than the written word typically. Not to say the written word is cheap. I do believe it's worth investing in and spending good money on, but nonetheless, it is usually a different cost, sort of cost spectrum to create a consistent flow of written content that can get you found, as opposed to creating the same volume of video or animation. So therefore, using it as a way to identify what video, what animation, what other channels to use is a great way to drive additional ROI from something that's already pretty good value, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also in a world where Google especially is looking at the authority of your content that you produce, blogging can serve as an excellent kind of forum and kind of central location for a business's kind of expertise throughout the business. It might be that Derek, who works in department X, is your go-to person for knowledge and experience, and being able to funnel some of that through marketing. You need some kind of framework to be able to achieve that, because obviously Derek doesn't have time to write everything down, otherwise he would. But if you can use blogging and that your marketing engine as a way of capturing and storing and sharing and getting more use out of expert knowledge within your business, it still has real value there, even if you're only doing it for the purpose of curation. So whether your budget is tight or budget is huge, there's still so many benefits you can get to blogging in 2023. I think.
Yeah. So like, where does it actually fit nowadays though? Because as I kind of mentioned in the intro, like blogging is just talked of less nowadays, isn't it? It really did used to be the go-to B2B marketing strategy that everyone was talking about and doing. So where does it actually fit in terms of like a B2B demand generation strategy now, Phil?
That's probably where we've seen some pretty big changes in its efficacy, I suppose. And if we think about demand generation being split into demand creation and demand capture, blogging and search in general has definitely moved significantly towards demand capture. people who've already got ideas about what problem they have and maybe even how they want to solve it turn to Google to progress that research phase and that discovery phase. But it's probably much less nowadays the source of idea creation, that spark, that moment where you discover something totally new for the first time and then pursue it all the way through to the purchase. We've seen attention and that kind of conversation move to other places. Nonetheless, one of the things that hasn't fundamentally changed about blogging in all the time that marketers have been adopting and perfecting it is the SEO benefit and the SEO gain, which is to say that blogging and internal linking and SEO structure applied to blogging is still a fantastic way to improve where essentially your main website is found for the terms that people use when they're much further along the purchase process. That hasn't changed dramatically of late. And so, again, for capturing demand from buyers who are very late stage looking for suppliers, blogging always was, although it wasn't necessarily fully understood by some, and still is, a great way to improve your position against those search queries, those search terms. And so it's definitely still an effective demand capture strategy. The SEO benefits of it still play a huge role in being found commercially. And so, and I think they still might be, there is still a chance that it can create demand. It's not completely, done for in that regard, but less so, because Google is going to be less often, and search engines are going to be less often the first point of call, or rather where people spend the majority of their time when they're not actively researching a specific problem that they've identified and they understand. So yeah, it's shifted.
Definitely. I think in terms of when I think about the demand generation strategy, it's never you start here and you end there. It's always a cyclical action. And when we go through the audit and the review stage of any content that we produce or any marketing activity that we do, blogging is usually one of the first ports of call when you go to, as we mentioned earlier, about how you can go about repurposing content. So you can, as part of your demand generation strategy, you can say, okay, well, what do we do? What worked? What didn't work? Okay, and of what worked, what can we do with it to make it better? If your budget allows, take a good blog and that, okay, we need to add more stuff into this existing piece of content. Or, if you've got more opportunity, you can say, right, okay, we need to turn this blog into an infographic. We need to turn this blog into a podcast episode. You want to turn this blog into some other form of content, reshare it. Reactivation is something that we talk about a lot of at the moment here at Blend, and being able to get more value out of your existing marketing is such a key aspect of demand generation strategy that helps you keep that engine ticking over for the highest amount of value possible. And you need to be able to and blogging, it fits a really key part of that when it comes to repurposing the stuff that you've already got, provided you've got it already, of course.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with the way that it's evolved into demand capture, because if you think about where like buyers spend their time now, they're seriously unlikely to go to your website /blog in anticipation of reading a new blog or a new piece of content. They might get that through a digest or something like that, but it's unlikely they're going to be checking in to see what content is there and available. They're kind of operating and sitting in other places like social and in communities to consume content rather than in your blogs. I mean, the blogs serve a purpose at a point in time. They aren't necessarily there for consumption at all times.
No, they're a very good way to answer a buyer's question and give before you try to get, which is very much still in the philosophy of inbound and our preferred approach to things. Give some value, don't always be on the take. But for a very long time, unless you cross the boundary between vendor and publisher content, then no one's coming to your website to see if you've published a new blog post, period. No one's subscribing to your blog to receive the next blog post by email voluntarily, period. And that's never really been part of our approach to blogging. It's about making yourself discoverable and available and giving value to people when they turn to that channel to find the answers to questions. But you're right, when people are sort of not actively researching, they are not looking at a blank Google search, waiting for inspiration. They are other places nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Seeing as this is called, the art of blogging, I suppose we should talk about the art of blogging and actually how to perfect the blog and the core components of a blog and a blogging strategy. So, Rob, I don't know if you can share some insights on how we create these beautiful pieces of content.
Yeah, I mean, you just walk up to a typewriter and you bleed. That's the shit. You just write stuff, okay, and then it comes true. To an extent, that is true. But I mean, when we talk about blogging, like the important thing is to think about is like the strategy always comes first, right? You need to know what it is you're trying to achieve. What is the goal of not just this piece of content, but also like blogging as a thing, right? You don't want to start doing it for no good reason. So, and depending on what your aspirations are, that will determine what goes into the copy, what goes into the blog and how you work it, but there are a few consistent and reliable things that all blogs should have, regardless of what your goals are, and chief among those, certainly to my view, is information, like good quality information. So, Google is all about, you've got to serve your buyer and you've got to make sure that, you are telling them things that they need, and, at the time where they need it, and we know that customers, really value being given stuff, for free, and being able to put yourself in a position where you are giving value is key. So high quality information from the best sources you have available to you. So if you run a business, like I said, go and find your expert knowledge people and tap into their brains, interview them, talk to them in their about their stuff, in the way that they talk about it, with their views and perceptions, and put that on the page, because that is going to be your absolute goal. Because it's not just factual information that's important, it's also having a good perspective on things also helps you stand out. If you don't have that, or you're a bit weaker in that area, then it's all about finding really good sources. And as a top shelf, as a general rule, if it's more than 2 years old, don't bother. As a stat or a study or a piece of content that has come out that you want to reference, don't put it in, because it ages so much faster than it used to. And I think now is that anything that is pre-COVID or during COVID is for a lot of things, particularly in B2B, service industry, professional services, that kind of stuff. A lot of the stuff that is like that and back is just irrelevant now, and a lot of times. So, that would be, very important to always scrutinize your older sources, I think. So with data is great, and being able to showcase it to a client, or a reader is really helpful. But in order to make a good blog, you need to create a compelling narrative that puts the buyer at the center of the story. I always think of it as it's the hero's journey, right? Okay, the reader is Luke Skywalker, and you've got to give him his lightsaber, get him on that ship, and blow up that Death Star, right? You need to create a narrative that says you're in position A, this is the problem you're trying to tackle, these are the challenges that you're going to face, and then what you can do to overcome those challenges. And if you're writing for commercial or with a sales kind of bent, obviously the solution is always going to be your product. But ideally, what you want to do is kind of like set the scene, build the road, and then kind of articulate all the pieces that go along the way. And sometimes you can do that through just literally describing things, but other times, it makes for a more compelling blog piece to have a real theme that sits behind all of that. So if you're writing about the benefits to a certain business process, and you want to kind of articulate the fact that you're going to get a lot of really small savings that build into a big saving, you could there are some corollaries to that in the world that you can use as themes. So if you were to take that as to say, okay, well, marginal gains is my benefit, or is my theme, and therefore, because marginal gains is a term that comes from the cycling world and velodromes, then I'm going to have a load of cycling allusions in my piece, and kind of and feed it in with a bit of variety and a bit of character, so that your narrative kind of fits not only the journey that people are going on, but also kind of gives a bit of flavor and excess to kind of make it stand out from the pack. Because just writing facts, is fine, but we can always do better. And at the end of the day, I believe that blog creation and writing generally, it's a creative effort. So put some creativity into it.
Yeah.
So we want to take them on a journey and make them feel something at the end of it. And by putting in a theme and having a strong narrative are really key to that, to really making that data sing that you've captured at the beginning.
Just on that point, I think absolutely agree. And I mean, there are some of the tenets of quality content in there. In addition, for a long time there has been more content than there are readers. There is a surplus of blog content, of content, full stop. And so, of course, and there's also there's more content than there is time to spend reading it as well. So I think it's always been important, or at least it's always been important in the time that we've been honing our B2B inbound demand generation approaches, to combine what you're talking about there, Rob, with the things that are going to get people to your content in the first place, and then get them to commit the time to experience it. So obviously, title is key to getting the click in the first place. So you've got to put a title above this piece of content that's effective at taking people from seeing it in search to your page. And then I think it's always really important to come out of the gates quick with something either very valuable or very interesting or very sort of alluring content-wise, so that there's a hook there that gives people an impetus to say, right, this is worth a bit more of my time than just bouncing back now and going into that quality narrative content that you've just described. Because if you do those two things right, and then you do what Rob's talking about, you've got a great opportunity to build some incredible trust and affinity with the reader. But of course, so much of the time, people are going to be clicking 3 or 4 titles in Google and exiting 3 out of 4 before they've even seen much of it. So that's a great way to elevate what you've written and get it in front of more eyes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when it comes to titles, you want to say things that make people stand up and think. And this is where having a perspective is really important. There's a lot of people in the C-suite that I've spoken to about what content do they read and what gets them to click on it is, if it's something I've not seen before, that makes me stand up and go, oh, if it is punchy and it comes out of the gate saying that, a not necessarily contrarian, but sort of a unique take on an issue that kind of presents some urgency, that's what gets people to click. And when a lot of people that we write for are in that sort of like C-suite level, they are time poor, so you got to tell them things immediately. And one of the things that you'll see a lot of when people talk about writing blogs is that there's a word count. Blogs should have a specific word count. Now, to an extent, for SEO purposes, that may or may not still be relevant. But from a reader's perspective, don't write any more than is required to answer the question that you put at the start of the piece. Tell your story in however many words it takes to tell it. So that might take 4,500 words, or it might take 800 words or less. Whatever it takes, just tell it. And there's no point in adding padding to it, because a word count isn't going to help a reader. It's not going to get anybody to convert from you, and it's not you're just wasting time. And when you talk about the value, when you talk about budget, time is a part of that conversation, how long it takes you to do stuff. So it's important that you write things that are kind of designed for people who are in the reading mindset, right? Nobody's reading a blog sat in a comfy chair with a pipe. They're able to spend all evening doing it, right? They want something that is punchy, short sentenced, well spaced, easy to read on screen. Headings are key. A lot of people skim read. It's more true of web pages than it is of blog content, because if it is good and compelling, people will read it all the way through. But you've got to, like you say, you've got to get that hook in and have that nice, easy structure so that people make their way down the page nice and evenly. And if you want to get people to move over into some other piece of content, or if there's something else that is relevant that might be interesting, your calls to actions should be relevantly and contextually placed so that they can continue to actually drive some kind of marketing value, I suppose. Now, if you go back to talk about websites, part of the thing you need to have in your blog obviously are links and calls to action, but you need to make sure that those are appropriately positioned so they don't disrupt the reader experience, because otherwise the the veil comes off, right? And you're no longer helping people. You're actually trying to get people to take action or do. You're trying to influence them, and then it looks bad. But if you can make things contextual, they don't even notice that it's happening to them, and then it becomes a lot easier, which I think is really important when it comes to blog creation. And I think for anybody who's writing blogs, who's watching this, is writing blogs, editing is a key thing, and we don't talk about this enough when it comes to blog creation. Proof it, read it out loud, put it to bed, sleep on it, look at it with fresh eyes the next day. Like, that is a 3-step process that I guarantee will make anything that you write better, because you can give it the time that it needs. Reading stuff aloud really helps you understand the flow and the readability of it, and how easy it is actually to read. And putting it to bed and looking at it the next day allows you to look at it with fresh eyes, and you don't get so caught up into it. Ideally give it to somebody else to read, and get them to edit it for you. But if you can't, put some space between you and it, and come back to it, and it will look a lot better by the time you're finished.
You've touched on two really important things there, I think, which is perspective and editing. I think perspective is already very important and will become only more important, because, let's face it, hardly anybody is in an industry without competitors, and hardly anybody is in an industry, particularly software, without competitors that look like they do more or less all the same things. But having an opinion, busting a myth, showing that you believe something strongly about the problem you're trying to solve, or the industry you're solving it for, or something specific like that, is a way to stand out from those competitors. So I think I've always enjoyed reading content where the beliefs of the company, its founders, the principles and the experts, is visible. And to get that across well, the editing process you talk about is really important. And I think both of those things are going to be more and more important as we see a rise of AI generated content, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, ultimately meaning there is a lot more of the kind of content that doesn't have perspective and doesn't have good editing in place, which ultimately we all need to rise above as much as possible and float to the top of probably a deeper sea of content in the very near future. So perspective is super important from my point of view.
Yeah, definitely. And when we talk about your blog itself on your website, where it sits, where it needs to do, we always recommend that just let the contents sit alone and be distraction free. So social sharing buttons down the side, all that kind of stuff. People don't click them, so don't bother having them there. You might think of it as being like, oh, it's a nice to have, or just in case and stuff, but we know nobody doesn't. So just don't do that. But to your point about authority and perspective, authorship is becoming so much more important. And I think as part of your blog, building in a named author and having links from that author onto their own page that has a bit of a digest of all the blogs that they've written, or they have have their name attached to, and links to their LinkedIn profile, will help Google better understand who that person is and make sure that authority really is there. It's more true in across B2B, the B2B space, but it's particularly true, in markets where Google takes a very high, puts it to a very high standard. So I'm thinking, kind of like health, pharmaceuticals, that kind of stuff, where Google has already taken strong steps to it in order to prove or disprove whether or not content is true or not, and that is now bleeding into this kind of how it's effectively fighting against AI generated content by saying this person does exist, they have these expertise, and they've written about this stuff extensively for a very long time. Google has a memory. That's the thing. The thing to remember is Google remembers stuff. So all of that starts to play into when you're starting to create your blog, even within your website architecture. Make sure that you allow for things like that, so that your authorship and your authority can show not just to your readers, but also to Google as well.
There's got to be some huge changes coming to Google's algorithm, surely, hasn't there? Given the changes that we're experiencing and the rate of change.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you guys have any views on AI, using AI to aid and generate blog content?
I mean, to generate blog content, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to create stuff using AI that is really useful to a lot of readers in a lot of situations, right? I think in terms of creating unique, authoritative, valuable content for people who don't know who you are and are in the very early stage of your buying process, I think it's a terrible idea, right? Because it's too generic is ultimately what it is, and we know that people, like, as we've explored, right? Perception is key, having an opinion is key, all these things are very, really important. I think where you can be valuable is where you're trying to translate stuff from one place to another place. So let's say you're a SaaS business, right? And you've got an application that has a whole load of technical directory information for implementation and guides for use and all that kind of stuff. Feeding that into ChatGPT, for example, and getting it to produce content that creates some nice user-friendly, end-user enabled content can be quite a nice cost-effective way to create some content for people who are already in your sphere as a value add. So I think that's, to my mind, that's where it sits. In terms of from a marketing perspective, I mean, you could use it to brief blogs, but I'm not sure. I kind of hesitate to take it any further than that. What do you think, Phil?
I think all content creators should probably be thinking of AI as a productivity tool, something that they can use to accelerate and augment their process, but not to be their process. But there are lots of people that will let it be their process. And I think that brings us to a very interesting sort of decision point as a species, potentially, which is either we see the changes which lets us distinguish between the AI generated, low quality, not unique, not human driven content, and that which is, and we value that which is, and we surface it and we prioritize it. Because if we don't, then wow, how do people discover anything anymore? So I can't answer that question. I don't think any of us can yet, but I think it is a looming question around the validity of content, full stop. But if we assume that we will prioritize, carefully created, curated content sourced from experts, then AI is a fantastic way to supplement the research process, the information gathering process, the structuring process to, much like, some of HubSpot's pretty groundbreaking sales tools for reps, to make them more productive, to make them more and get them to spend more time on the very, very interesting parts of content creation, which is sourcing the expert opinion, understanding it, developing a perspective, applying it, creating narrative, editing, for quality, and getting it out into the world. So it can be a huge gain. But I, for one, fall on the side of, I hope that we generally adopt the point of view that content that is simply produced by this stuff, for the time being anyway, doesn't have much value.
And is actually becoming quite easy to recognize. Like, you'll find with ChatGPT, if you just get a generic response back, most of the time, the second paragraph or third paragraph will start with however, comma. So it's like, it's quite interesting to see, scrolling through LinkedIn, how it's coming about.
That is a very initial picture. Yes, it will do that. But you can, if you feed ChatGPT or any kind of algorithm enough of your own content, it starts to write in your vernacular and your way and your style. So it will only be a matter of time before it will be indistinguishable. In the same way that AI created art. If you look at that, it's moving in the direction where it used to go all Rob Liefeld and it couldn't draw hands to now it can draw hands. And it is getting there, and it will start to develop. It will start to get better. But when I think about this as a from a cultural kind of perspective, I like to look like the e-commerce space is a really interesting one for me when it comes to AI, because e-commerce generally for the web has spent a lot of time gaming Google and gaming Amazon and gaming all these algorithm-based search tools in order to make their stuff fit. And they're in a constant battle. Every time there's an overhaul of changes, you see that they drop, all their rankings drop, and they have to build it back up again with the new next tactic. And I feel that if your business is using AI generated content as part of your normal blogging strategy, the same thing's going to happen to you, is that Google will catch up, it will punish you hard, and you have to find something else to do. But what won't happen is that anything that you created beforehand will not be affected by it, because it will be smart enough to be able to determine the difference. And ultimately, if you are a human being creating valuable content based on other human beings' views and sharing it to other human beings, you insulate yourself from that kind of the threat of technologies fighting against each other, or like this perceived battle of fighting against each other. So I think there is a place for it, but we need to be very intelligent about how we apply it. And it's not, you run a risk if you decide that you're just going to use AI to generate all your content for your blog for the purposes of having a blog. It's there needs to be more to it.
I think we've got to assume, based on historical big changes, that Google at least will try to identify that content and de-rank it, right? So, and there was that whole few years ago when backlinking came under scrutiny. There were lots of people suffered horrendous losses in traffic, and but it was as a result of doing something that they knew was gaming the system as opposed to creating value for people. And so we have to assume, I think, that it's very likely that will be repeated. But as you've said, Rob, if ultimately you were and continue to focus on providing value, then most of the time these changes are in your favor, and benefit you as opposed to harm you.
Yeah, and this is why I'm such a huge fan of including other elements within a blog, as well as the written word as well, like videos, like embedded podcast clips and stuff like that, because it only adds to your perspective and your overall authority and expertise on that topic. Because there's no way that if I'm there might be soon, but there's no way that an AI can perfectly replicate me talking about a particular topic right now. Give it a year, it's probably going to come out.
It can only do your voice. I think it's 12 seconds or something. It can do your voice. But yeah, you're right. And ultimately, blogging can serve as a really good repository for all of those different pieces of information that you're going to create. And ultimately, a lot of times we see blogs eventually, blogs that do well eventually turn into pillar pages, that spawn topics of their own, and offshoots that create topic clusters, and all of which goes back to like serving your website, which ultimately is what we are all here to kind of advocate for, is making sure that you're a business with a website that works in the way that you want it to. And blogs are for a lot of people, just they might not be doing much today, but over time, and it builds up and it ranks, and it continues to be successful. You keep feeding it and it'll be as tall as this. It's just one of those things. It is the long-term investment. It continues to be the main reason for doing blogs today. Is that you will still end up getting success off of it years after you put the initial investment in. So even if you are a business that is pinched, or having your marketing budget slashed, you can always know that in 4 years' time, that thing that you wrote yesterday is still going to be there and still going to be doing well, or still has the opportunity to really do well if you put the right kind of effort behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if you can share any tips then, Rob, on how to, we've got the perfect blog, as we spoke about, we know how to write it. How do we actually get it to rank, to be seen? What are some, tips for overall visibility?
Activation of content is an interesting one. So depending on your channels that you want to be using, obviously make it rank for keyword or a long tail keyword, usually search query, that can get it in front of eyeballs, but then you run the risk of being hit by your zero click searches, right? So you'll be in the featured snippet and nobody clicks through, and therefore you're seen, but you don't get anything for it per se. So depending on your channels, you want to create an activation strategy that suits it. So I think for featured snippets, it's an interesting one. So it's like there's a word limit. So what you want to be doing is, like, if you want to get people to click through, create lists that are long enough so that people have to click through to see the rest of the list. So if they're more than 8 items, people have to click through. If it's a block of text, make sure that it's got, as Phil said, like a really good hook in that featured snippet piece of featured snippet text. So answer the question, but ... the real secret lies beyond. Get people to click through. So write your content in a way that helps you do that. That will help you overcome those things. Even if so as you start to rank, you will need to do that. The rest of it is, looking at your social media pushes and your blog email digests. Just literally send it to people. There is no reason why a successful piece of content can't have a little bit, if it does well on LinkedIn, have a little bit of a social boost to get out of your pool of your echo chamber of social followers into your actual buyer's nest, and then get them to look at it. There is an opportunity there that you can use. You want to be able to kind of create opportunities, where you can with what you've got. That's one of the big things, and we see a lot of customers will click through on the email digest, and then that helps with those initial search positions, because you can see there's a lot of traffic going to that blog. So those are things that you can really do to help support it. And you want to make sure that you're layering your activations in a way that helps each one help the other one, because there's only so much time in the world for us to activate the content, and there's so many people there to read it, right? So the other thing I would say you want to get people to read it would be to link through to other pieces. So as you create something new, link it from something old that is successful. So if you know that blog Y gets 3,000 views a month, put a link in there to your new piece of content, and then people might click through and then look at that, and then that helps that new piece of content, that helps it rank on its own, and there's an opportunity there, I guess. So there's a lot of internal linking opportunities that you've got for activation.
You've touched on a really important point there, which is every new blog is a part of the whole, and it's always important to view it as a whole, and to go back and look at how things can be reconnected to produce better results, whether it's sort of up the SEO tree towards commercial results, or to help new content rank, and so on. So I think that is a really important point. Each new blog post is not just a new blog post, it is an additional cog in the machine. So viewing those things as a whole piece and optimizing them really important. I'm pretty down on lead nurturing, generally speaking. It's never proven itself to me to be a sort of a buyer-centric, effective tactic. But digesting that blog post via email, I think, has got its merits. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that it can simply never be, if you're blogging with the right intentions, it can never be salesy. It's like, here's our latest piece of thought on a topic that you might find relevant. You don't have to click it. There's no CTA in it besides read the piece. That is an effective means of using email to keep in touch with an audience that you've built one way or another. And it's the only form of lead nurturing that I've ever had any sort of love for whatsoever.
Being part of mind, right?
Yeah, and then organic and paid social, not necessarily promoting the content you've written for the blog. It might need to be repurposed. It might need to be customized and adapted for the channel, but that's why you do the blogging. That's to facilitate that to power that creation of content, but putting versions of it, snippets from it, stats from it, or the content itself in some situations, organically on social, particularly on LinkedIn for B2B at present, but also through paid promotion on LinkedIn, reflecting the fact that your group of followers and connections may not totally represent your target audience, your buyer. You might need to include paid in there. These are ways to maximize the activation and the visibility and the discoverability of the content that you've gone to the effort to create.
Yeah. So once you've activated, then I think measurement is a key thing to cover here, because ultimately you need an arm to defend why you're blogging, and some kind of return on that. So I don't know if Rob, you want to talk to that?
Everybody talks about what is the return am I going to get on this, on content? What is the return on content? And it's such a hard conversation to have, and loads of marketers have it. And the key thing is to recontextualize the question, because otherwise you run into the very murky world of vanity metrics, which blogging and content creation generally is a real hive of vanity metrics that people might think are important, but they're just not, right? Because if you think about where where content sits in terms of your marketing, your marketing strategy, you can't hold them to the same account. The strategy needs to be achieving these things, okay? And these are the things, these are the metrics that actually matter, because these are the ones that directly impact sales pipeline. These are the things that lead to money coming in through the door, right? The blog that you have written should not be held to the same standard as that. The blog didn't convert, therefore it's a bad blog, right? It's not a good way to measure the success of a piece of content, in my mind. So things that you should be measuring, organic search traffic is a really big one, obviously, because in context of how it helps support the rest of your website and help uplift the pages that really matter. I think that's a really important one. I think click-through rate, in the sense of you've written a good piece that helps lead, that clicks through to a more valuable piece of content or a more valuable page, I think is a good one to go for, rather than email digest click through, or was this blog interesting enough for people to click and engage with. I think that's not as important. I think when you think about what your bottom line is trying to do, you're not going to move the needle by making people click on a blog more often, right? I think and I think one of the big one is one that we've talked about before on the show, is self-reported attribution, right? If people can say, I've been reading your content for years and now I decided to buy, that's a really good way to say, well, okay, we can't say that our blog is doing XYZ things specifically, but we know that it is capturing demand that is out there, or is creating new demand that is out there, and that is good enough to justify its continued existence in the world. You don't need much to be able to make it worth somebody's while to creating content at the end of the day. And if you really needed a reason to do it, it's just to say, like, everybody else is doing it. If competitors are doing it, you've got to stay competitive. You've got to be in the space where they're playing. And that is the challenge. I always, but then again, when we talk about measuring success, I always compare it to kind of what you're arguing against versus what you should actually be measuring independently of the blog, I suppose. But
yeah, I think sometimes perhaps not all marketing should be measured, in a weird way. So like the reasons to create blog content, in my mind, are: number one, each and every time, give some value, answer a question, bust a myth, share some knowledge. Ultimately, you never know ahead of time if that blog post is going to be 10 visits a month, 100 visits a month, or 10,000 visits a month. You just don't know that with certainty. But if you're giving value every time, then there's justification for writing each and every one of them, regardless of what you get. But the impact of adding that piece of content to your machine, to your estate, should ultimately, ideally, be improved position for commercial and high volume informational keywords, because of good organization, good alignment of topics, and good implementation of SEO. So you should rank more highly for terms that bring buyers to your website, and over time, as a result, increased MQL generation, high intent lead conversion. And of course, you can't tie one of those MQLs directly to the publishing of a blog post. But over the years, we have seen that inbound behaviors like blogging, when implemented with this sort of view that it's about getting buyers onto your site when they're ready to buy, it produces beneficial impacts. It increases the number of MQLs you generate if you sustain the activity. And it can be correlated well enough with that end result for me to continue to recommend that people do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't try and attribute one piece of content, to where it's sat in the buyer's journey, because you just end up never satisfying yourself or anybody else, really, ultimately.
And don't look at bounce rate.
Don't look at bounce rate. Gee, is your bounce rate 90%? That's fine. It's
mine's 100. Cool. Right, let's wrap it up there anyway. Cool. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Demand Decoded on blogging. If you found it useful, we'd love to hear your feedback, to grow, evolve these, and make them bigger and better. Be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page for the future events. And you can actually check out previous episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, so you can either watch or listen, whatever your preference is. Just search for Demand Decoded and you'll find it there. Cool. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.